And so we move on to part B of the France-Germany talk, the structure of the relationship between these two countries. In other words, what's in it for France? What's in it for Germany? Let's start with France first. And there's background here, which is the different attempts that the French had made since 1870, since France's historic defeat by Prussia in September 1870 at the Battle of Sedan, and the subsequent creation of the German Empire in early 1871. And initially the French had tried to contain this very big and uncomfortable neighbour by an alliance with Russia, and that hadn't been a striking success in the war of 1914 to 18. And then, of course, there had been an attempt to control Germany through the Treaty of Versailles, and that really was an object lesson in how not to handle a defeated enemy, because in the event the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany enough to cause very great resentment among the Germans, but did not break German power sufficiently to prevent Germany from recovering economically and militarily sufficiently to fight another major war in 20 years from the Treaty of Versailles. So, come 1945, France's initial reflex was to inflict on Germany a more punitive, a more disabling, a more crippling peace by permanently internationalizing the heartland of German industry, that is the Ruhr coal and steel area, and by effectively dismembering, taking apart the German Reich and breaking it into separate states. And initially there was quite a lot of support for this line among the British and the American allies. For example, if you look at the so-called Morgenthau Plan, you can see the cover of the plan. It was made into a book in 1944. The idea then was to deindustrialize Germany. But very quickly, the Allies lost sympathy with this idea. And you can see why in that little extract from General Sir Alan Brooke's diary. He's writing in August 1944. The French haven't even kicked the Germans, or the Allies haven't even kicked the Germans out of France yet. And Alan Brooke is already looking to the post-war period and seeing Russia as the dominant power in Europe, and therefore a need in the name of balance of power politics to build up Germany to oppose Russia. And for quite a long time, the French, under de Gaulle's post-war provisional government, were deeply worried about the idea of German recovery. But in the end, they had to accept it. They had no choice. France was still, after all, heavily dependent on American loans. And so France had to accept the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, West Germany. And the question then arose, well, how to allow German recovery and without leading to German dominance, still less to German militarism. And that's really what was behind the coal and steel community and subsequent steps to European integration. There's always this leitmotif of containing Germany. But of course, that isn't all that France sees in the European project and the project of Franco-German friendship. The French also have a lot to gain from finding markets for their agriculture. French agriculture, which had been rather primitive early in the 20th century. The French hadn't been terribly good at feeding themselves, despite having all this wonderful agricultural land. The French agriculture in the 1950s was becoming very much more productive and therefore needing export markets. France was becoming the third, then the second biggest exporter of agricultural produce in the world. And so the idea of a big European market for French produce was quite positive from the French point of view. Then too, the French see economic integration in Europe and the challenge of German industry as a sort of spur to their own modernization. French industry had been rather protected, rather small scale, rather family owned. The idea of the 50s and especially the 60s was to modernize French industry, to make it bigger, more competitive. This was a constant motif of de Gaulle's policies in particular. Then too, the French see in Europe a sort of an economic lever to try and impose tighter financial discipline, tighter economic discipline on the French economy. Notably in 1958 under de Gaulle and 1983 under Mitterrand, packages of quite unpopular measures were imposed in France in the name of European integration. Europe, in a sense, was a tool to help create a more disciplined French economy. Then too, there's a clear political or diplomatic aim that the French have in the European project, which is effectively harnessing German economic power to French leadership of Europe. France alone cannot hope to be a very great power after World War II, any more than the United Kingdom could. But Europe could be still a sizable economic and maybe political power. Hence, de Gaulle's use of the term a lever of Archimedes, the idea that if the six pulled together, they could be as good, said de Gaulle to his minister Alain Perfit, as good as do as well as either of the superpowers. And if France was to lead this European ensemble, then France could be, this is what de Gaulle said privately, France could regain the status she had lost at Waterloo as being the first among nations. So Europe as a force multiplier for French political and diplomatic power, enabling France to punch above her weight. What's in it for the Germans? Well, first of all, of course, there's a market for German industrial goods. Even today, the 27 EU countries account for 59% of German exports. And export-led growth has been essential to the post-war economic model of Germany as it developed in sharp contrast to the autarkic model of the Nazi regime. Then too, there are political elements to the German project. The idea of making a return after the catastrophic defeat of 1945, making a return to the international scene, discreetly, within a clear framework of Europe. Germany, after 1945, could not afford, and had no wish to afford, to regain national self-assertiveness openly and quickly. But Germany still had its own interests to seek to advance. And Europe and the partnership with France were a very good tool to do this. If Germany had a project, it was far more effective to present it as a Franco-German project than simply a German one. And then too, there were diplomatic gains to be had from the Franco-German partnership for Germany. Germany in the Cold War was heavily dependent on the United States for her security. France, in that context, was not exactly an alternative to the United States. There could not be no alternative to the United States in terms of protecting Berlin, West Berlin, in terms of protecting Germany's eastern frontier against the Warsaw Pact. But France as an ally to offset American dominance was extremely important, especially in the mindset of Konrad Adenauer. So Germany in the post-war years, certainly until the 70s and probably longer, was what's called a reflexive multilateralist. That is to say what Germany sees multilateral institutions like NATO, like the European Economic Community, as the appropriate way to advance its own national interest. European integration, partnership with France are needed for economic and political recovery. And to achieve these things, Germany has historically been willing to pay, and pay quite a lot, into the European budget. If you look at the chart that I have put there under, I think, B2 in the lecture notes I've given you, have a good look at the chart and you'll see how Germany is the biggest net contributor to the budget of the EU, and it has always been thus. So, to conclude this little section, France and Germany have common interests, but that doesn't mean that they work in perfect harmony. Each has something to gain from the partnership, but those things aren't absolutely identical. Both the EU and the Franco-German Treaty of 1963 have effective mechanisms for conflict resolution. But recently, and we'll come to this later, the relationship has come under challenge as the balance between France and Germany, always rather delicate, has undergone certain modifications and has, to a degree, been destabilised. That's the end of Part B.